Hello, and I will begin by saying good evening or afternoon or morning to everyone who is out there in what we affectionately call Zoom Nation. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I'm the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia University. And I begin by situating the university on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, and we respect their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future rights and presence of the Lenni Lenape on their rightful homeland. For the past 29 years, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, founded by the late Professor Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate of social responsibility in Black studies. Dr. Marable offered a prescient reminder in a New York Times article from 1998 that, quote, Black studies must utilize history and culture as tools by which an oppressed people can transform their lives and the entire society. Scholars have an obligation not to just interpret, but to act, end quote. The Institute serves as an academic resource center for a local and global community that has cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and New York City's rich history and culture. Now, in partnership with our Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, we continue to expand the array of contemporary scholarship and interpretation of the diasporic Black experience, like this year's special series, Black Counter Cartographies, which we're happy to have co-sponsored with the Institute for Comparative Literary Studies and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race here at Columbia. Conceived with my colleague, Dr. Vanessa Agart-Jones, Black Counter Cartographies brings together in dialogue geographers and artists, poets and architects in this series of conversations exploring the spatial practices of Black life across the diaspora and how they construct what Mpho Matsipa calls counter cartographies of sociality, imagination, and liberation. Geographies encapsulate modernity's production of space and time, subjected to the metrics of markets and politics. Within that sphere, the racialization of peoples of African descent has historically and continues to produce sites of extraction, exploitation, dispossession, and displacement. The field of Black geography challenges these discursive formations and reimagines the cadences of everyday spatial practices. So we couldn't think of two people whose work engages Black counter-cartographic spaces between sites of the continent and diaspora than curator scholar Dr. Mpho Matsipa and architect and researcher Emanuel Admassu. So joining me in this conversation today is my colleague, Dr. Vanessa Agart-Jones, who's an assistant professor of anthropology here at Columbia University, where she is affiliated with IRAAS-AAADS and the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender and the Center for Science and Society. At its most expansive, Dr. Agart-Jones's work asks how coloniality is made material in social forms, in human and non-human bodies, and in the landscapes in which we live. With a focus on Black life in the Atlantic world, she conducts historical and ethnographic research on racialization, environmental crisis, and the politics of gender and sexuality. But also, she is a 2005 MA graduate from the Institute for Research in African American Studies. And I turn it over to Vanessa to introduce Dr. Matsipa and Professor Admassu.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. I am thrilled to be here with all of you today in Zoom Nation and introducing our panelists, our scholars, our conversation partners for the afternoon. Dr. Mpho Matsipa is a researcher, designer, and curator of African Mobilities, a multi-platform creative project on time, space, and African mobility. She has taught at the University of the Witwatersrand, the Cooper Union, and Columbia University, written critical essays on art and architecture, and curated several transnational exhibitions and discursive platforms. Most recently, Dr. Matsipa was Loeb Fellow at Harvard University, that's 2022, and a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. Dr. Matsipa is an associate curator for the Lubumbashi Biennale in the Democratic Republic of Congo for 2023. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Matsipa here as the theorist of counter cartography, from whom we were most inspired in our thinking about this series. I'm going to also introduce Emanuel Admassu, who is an assistant professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. He's a founding partner with Jen Wood of AAAD-SAAADSColumbiaU, an art and architecture practice based in New York, and by extension between Melbourne and Addis Ababa. He's also a co-founding board member of the Black Reconstruction Collective. Professor Admassu's art, design, and teaching practices operate at the intersection of design theory, spatial justice, and contemporary African art. His forthcoming book with Anita Bateman, Where is Africa?, actively seeks to unpack the imperialist foundations of cultural institutions and their anthropological fascinations with African objects, people, and places by promoting dialogue, memory, and everyday practice to construct what theorist Mpho Matsipa calls a counter cartography. After presentations from Dr. Matsipa and Professor Admassu, we will have a conversation, then open to the audience for Q&A toward the end of this event. So please post your questions in the Q&A window on Zoom, and we look forward to your conversation with us all. Thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to our conversation partners.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilson and Professor Agard-Jones, for this very generous invitation and introduction. I'd never really imagined myself as the author of the concept of a counter cartography, but it's actually a conversation that emerged, or a concept that emerged in conversation with a wide range of interlocutors, both on the African continent and in parts of New York. So I want to start, first of all, let me try and screen share. Right. So I want to start with a few theoretical benchmarks that have been very critical to my own understanding about how I situate myself as a spatial thinker and Black woman and a theorist in the field of architecture and urban planning. And my starting point is with Toni Morrison, who suggests that the idea of Africa in the West is an idea that is fraught with the assumptions of a complex intimacy coupled with an acknowledgement of unmediated estrangement. The literary tropes, according to Morrison, of Africa are exact replicas of perceptions of foreignness. Africa as threatening, Africa as depraved, Africa as incomprehensible. This conundrum of the dispossession of native peoples constitutes an exile within one's home that not only enables the projection of colonial fantasies of Africa as a void, as timeless, as ripe for intervention or extraction, but also the dystopian character of imperialism as catastrophe for the majority world. As argued by scholars like Catherine Yusuf, imperialism and ongoing settler colonialism have been ending worlds for a very long time indeed. However, my real understanding around Black cartographies began with the work of Catherine McKittrick, who argues that this unmappability and temporal suspension of the Black subject may be considered one articulation of Black time and space. Unlike linear time, Black time moves in many directions at once. Twisted time, stretched time, deep time, suspended time, wasted time, hard time, liminal time, slow time. And this idea of thinking about space through time is also about thinking about the ways in which the distribution of waiting coincides with the distribution of power. There are those who wait and those who are waited for. So in this seminar, what I would like to really talk about is to reflect on some of the work that I've done with African Mobilities, which actually began as a way of thinking about the ways in which Black time and connectivity is deeply fragmented, but also served to forge a transnational incubator and network for designers and theorists who are somewhat removed from global centers of institutional, cultural, and economic power. This presentation is also in some way a brief for me to think about the Lubumbashi Biennale in 2024, where I'm an associate curator. So some of the motifs that I've started to think about in relation to the question of Black cartographies is around 6 themes: circulation, extractions, dust, ruin, decay, and the future of time. Again, Catherine Yusuf discusses the ways in which the blues establish time outside of European sense of time and factory time. She argues that blues time is taken as a space and a subversive territory of place. So I'm interested in the idea and art practices that reveal how making time into space creates the possibility of territory, free from enslaved labor, a counter-poetics that is subterraneanly subversive of its surface reality, a counter-ethic, according to Yusuf, that is at the same time a counter-ethic that is at the same time a counter-ethic, and whether this can be translated into a set of design practices. So in thinking about the ways in which the distribution of knowledge and centers of knowledge are structured globally. So in thinking about the cartography of knowledge production on the planet or on the globe and where the centers of knowledge production are, a large part of the curatorial approach for African mobilities is really about producing a cartography that links highly distributed, fragmented knowledge networks and centering them around particular urban centers on the African continent and also in the diaspora. So that included staging platforms in cities like New York, Johannesburg, Harare, Kampala, Lagos, Cape Verde, and also other secondary sets of, and Dakar, and also secondary sets of activities with live events that happened over this kind of 4-year period. And I really thought about African mobilities as a distributed exhibition and a momentary aggregation of distributed intelligence across the continent. And the motivation for this work was a recognition of the epistemic closure surrounding discourses on African architecture and urbanism through a narrow developmental frame that structures our spatial imagination as a linear temporal trajectory. I also wanted to cultivate a sustainable and fluid space for knowledge exchange in a context of radical uncertainty, and where our mobility is often constrained by under-resourced, fragmented institutions and infrastructures and institutional racism and sexism. And thirdly, I wanted to explore the possibilities of curatorial practice as an infrastructural project that leverages partnerships with well-resourced institutions in a global network of exchange. This culminated in the production of a set of platforms across the continent, podcasts. African mobilities model that I developed excluded these exchanges that aim to support intellectual and cultural mobility in Africa and the diaspora, and it included 9 institutions, 6 regional collaborators, 5 experimental platforms on the African continent. And between April and June in 2018, 44,000 visitors to the museum, a traveling exhibition in Lagos, and a podcast series that is still quite actively used, surprisingly. So here are just some images of the work. So one of the ways that I've also been thinking about this idea of fragmented infrastructure is through the frame of brokenness, and how the idea of progress, innovation, and seamlessness subtend a lack of correspondence between everyday life practices and indeterminacy, ushered in by violent extraction of natural resources and the destruction of natural ecosystems. The turbulence and upheavals produced by breakdown and constant flux in the environment, political and social systems, and the economies creates an absence of imaginaries that have a material basis in a collective understanding to which people refer to make sense of their lives. So these are some of the outputs from the exhibition where contributors really sort of explored the implications of thinking through the circulation of Africans and developing their own set of vocabularies in spaces that don't exist, spaces in the near future, all experiments in these kind of invisibilized, unmappable spaces that don't appear in conventional cartographic spaces. So this lack of correspondence also signals a mode of being within indeterminacy that is rooted in a notion of hope, of eventuality, and the ways in which sites of abandonment create conditions of possibility for new spatial practices and socialities to emerge. If there is something to be learned from non-European modernity, it may be a call to the attentiveness to the slippages between survival and innovation as conditions for making the world in new ways, through which the language of repair finds its corollary in the language of restitution and justice. The third theme, dust, has been very generative for me as I work and think through the work of South African artist Senzeni Mahasela. Senzeni Mahasela works with very quotidian, domestic, feminine materials like thread, blanket, like threads and blankets that are sort of associated with female colonial labor, through the production of her alter ego Theodora, who wore the same red cotton dress and eat jelly every day for 6 years, and walked through the streets of Johannesburg as she refused to disclose the inventory of subtle humiliations and subtle victories that she faced in her laborious flânerie through Johannesburg's art galleries, shopping malls, streets, restaurants, taxi ranks, weddings, and family gatherings. But what was striking for me is the way in which Senzeni Mahasela's cartography of Johannesburg is both an embodiment of the landscape of extraction, but also an expression and exploration of female cartographies in Johannesburg in the post-colonial and the colonial era. In discussion about her extensive use of the color red, Mahasela states, "Red is the color of dust. Red is the color of blood. Red is the color of initiation. Red is the color of false prophecies and witchcraft. Red is the color of land. Red is the color of landlessness, soillessness. Red is the color of empire. Red is the color of Sarah Batman. Red is the color of Theodora. Red is the color of Senzeni. Red is the color of Johannesburg and loss and memory and time. Lost, yet to come, already here. The city has never been beautiful, but there is more." Ruin. Another foundational site for thinking about Black diasporic imaginaries and cartographies, as well as their creative networks within sites of urban decay and abandonment, was Black hair braiding on Bree Street in downtown Johannesburg. Hair practices in downtown Johannesburg and the spatialities they engender constitute one of the creatively textured sites through which Black women challenge and unmake binary constructions of space, race, and beauty. This is important because Black and African bodies and sexuality have been represented historically through recurring stereotypical images of Black and African bodies as grotesque, uncivilized, and cruelly sexual. However, hair braiding practices on the street are also significant because they invert intimate practices of bodily care that would otherwise be considered a private and feminine activity, and they transformed zones of precarity, economic and cultural exchange into a viable public domain. So rather than being merely ontological, Black hair braiding practices in downtown Johannesburg, as well as possibly 125th Street, New York, and various other such locations, and the spaces that they occupy constitute a form of knowledge about both the precarity and opportunities of a porous, unconsolidated, and compromised modernist urban and architectural milieu. This disruption of the established order of the modernist apartheid city is similar in part to what James Holston describes as insurgent citizenship. But I'm interested in a slightly different kind of insurgency. I'm interested in reading this space with Tina Campt and Catherine Yusuf, who suggests that quiet acts within an aesthetic of chaos are reworked in a new poetic grammar to create insurgent geologies of belonging, one that refuses capture and redirects the unstratified forces as a sense of possibility. These acts reconceptualize how Black women reclaim a right to geography within the carceral confines of what is considered and continues to be a plantation logics of the modernist and apartheid city. It also introduces the idea of senses as theoreticians that establishes how modes of experience are established in a sense as theoretical formulation of subjectivity made in a context of the denial of that subjectivity. This aesthetic or political affect, as Yusuf describes it, is deeply political because it relates to the possibility of life and survival and it's under conditions of violence. And then finally, in terms of thinking about decay, one of the recurring maps that I encountered while I was at Harvard, and both as maps and also as a discourse, was the kind of inflated role of the global north in the production of carbon greenhouse gas emissions, and how this sort of positions the global north as the people who are going to author the climatic future for the rest of the world. But what I'm most interested in terms of thinking about these cartographies is the work of Sami Baloji, particularly his work on Memoir in 2007, and Jean Mukendi Katembaye, who suggests a new vision of the world. Jean Katembaye's work and his drawings of light bulbs take a skillful look at colonialism in Africa. The iconic shape of an incandescent light bulb depicts imaginative wirings for what the artist calls black lights. The series serves as a shorthand for the socioeconomic disparities that relates to energy, environment, and the daily restrictions of power faced by many African societies. I think this is important because dominant discourses around climate change and mineral extraction often inadvertently wipe the majority of the world off the map. As you may or may not know, the Southern Congo sits on an estimated 3.4 million metric tons of cobalt, a critical mineral that accounts for almost half the world's known supply. So while experts claim that Africa produces less than 2% of greenhouse gas emissions, which may or may not have implications for how climate policies are shaped, mining extraction of critical minerals, such as rare earth elements, lithium, and cobalt, can be found in products from computers and household appliances. They also keep inputs in key energy technologies like batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar panels. So in thinking about the future of time and African temporalities, I'm also thinking about Black matter and spatial practices and its relationship to time. So I want to close here because I don't want to take up too much space and allow space for discussion. And in thinking about Black futures, Black spatialities, and the future of time, I return to Toni Morrison, who wrote an essay of the same title, The Future of Time, Literature, and Diminished Expectations. Morrison identifies disruption and apocalyptic yearnings as a lament for a return to the ideologies of progress and continuity in the modern West, but also identifies the modern West as the site from which imaginaries of the future are at their most impoverished. So while we might think about queuing and time and the idea of Africans waiting through this kind of frame of progress, the queue and this idea of being in a linear trajectory suggests a queue that is defined by a kind of collective temporal boundary and an orderly arrangement for synchronization of everyday life, fixed forms of temporal organization that are sequential and synchronized and that create and maintain hierarchical relations within the matrix of power between those who wait, mainly in Africa, and those for whom others must wait, and those who wait without end. However, the queue, this act of waiting, of Black time, might also have exuberant and reparative gestures that emerge in response to the disintegration of colonial historical narrative and foreclosure of settler futures. The liminal time of the queue and the refusal of disciplinary and normalizing mechanisms of power produces a state of radical unknowability, indeterminacy, and unintelligibility. Thus, Black time as liminal has the potential to unsettle a clear hierarchy and a neat binary opposition in which one modality of being should transform into another. The Black temporality of waiting, not unlike queer temporalities, carries ludic and liberatory traits that generates new forms of art and subjectivity. Thus, the queue also gives rise to line specialists and line tactics, non-normative temporalities, confused, opaque identities in order to avoid asymmetrical power relations and harmful ideological interpolation. These Black temporalities are promiscuous precisely because the delay locates one in a liminal state of being, which has transgressed and violated expected temporal boundaries. This form of temporal transgression, of being out of time, creates a shift in spatial and temporal coordinates that repeatedly disrupt linear time and hold open the possibility for a reorganization of multiplications of time and the enactment of diverse futures in the immediate present. So this final work by Jean Mukendi Katembaye wishes to eliminate the imbalance between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. The artist shows the trajectory of the Earth around its axis, rotation, and around the sun, translation. Thus, whoever is near the equator performs a greater revolution than whoever is near the poles. By adding this natural order of things to a third random revolution, which he describes as rotation, one can restore balance. Together with members of Manao project, Katembaye is looking for ways to achieve this third revolution for undoing imbalance in the world. So this leaves me with a few questions in closing. What kind of institutions of care and conditions of possibility for new modes of practice are embedded in the social? What kinds of collective imaginaries proceed during and after the demise of extraction? What is the role And what are the conditions of possibilities for more relational and transdisciplinary thinking? And who owns and governs the stratosphere? And could this be the new frontier of colonial expansion? I think we need to draw new maps in which African perspectives and Black perspectives from elsewhere on the future is central to this perspective and not marginal for a different future and our collective survival. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matsipa. I'm going to let Professor Admassu take it away.
Thank you, Professor Wilson and Professor Agard-Jones for the invitation. But also thank you, Mpho, for that incredible presentation. I'm honored to be part of this wonderful series on Black Counter Cartographies. And I would say, more importantly, for asking me to have an open conversation with someone I have been in dialogue with for the past decade. Mpho has been a limitless source of inspiration and support ever since we met. I believe we met when I was a graduate student. And at the time, I was attempting to find the right language to articulate my fascination with Mercato, the central marketplace of Ethiopia. And she generously supported the project and helped me understand the importance of continuing to do this work, both within and outside these institutions and disciplines. So based on this invitation, I decided to basically revisit my work and think through some of these themes and how they show up in different projects. Specifically, this idea of Black Counter Cartographies. My teaching and creative practices have, for the most part, focused on Black spatial practices in 3 cities: Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Atlanta, Georgia. And of course, one of the most definitive aspects of colonial cartography is its relentless attempt to make Black life measurable. And this interest in quantification has produced various technologies of containment, both on and off the continent of Africa. As Achille Mbembe writes, our history has been a history of constant displacement and confinement. To be African or to be Black means to be consigned to one or the other of the many spaces of confinement that modernity invented. In all 3 cities, we have been analyzing the cartographic imaginations imposed on landscapes occupied by Black people. In Dar es Salaam, the segregationist master plan divided the city into 3 zones. Zone 1, the peninsula, was reserved for Europeans. Zone 2 was reserved for Asians, mainly people from India. And Zone 3 was reserved for indigenous Africans. In Addis Ababa, during the 5-year Italian occupation, the colonial army managed to take over the center of the city, reserving it for Europeans, while drawing up a Cartesian master plan for an area that they called Mercato Indigeno, or the indigenous market, on the northwestern periphery of the city. And the grid of Mercato really operates in contradistinction to the pre-colonial settlement of the city. Addis Ababa was, for the most part, settled as a constellation of compounds for a mobile army on hilltops surrounding the royal Gibbi. This word, the Amharic word Gibbi, connotes a territory surrounded by a wall or fence, basically a zone of respite and relative stability carved out of an errant and restless city. And a variety of materials are used to fence in the plots: eucalyptus trunks, corrugated sheets, metal grills, stone, and masonry. And Gibbis contain houses, parks, schools, gardens, spaces of worship, and commerce. And they host events such as weddings, wakes, religious rituals, and celebrations. And the boundary of the Gibbi has literal and metaphorical depth. It is not a line on a map, but a zone of contestation pushed and pulled by shifts in politics, culture, and economy. And it tethers between selective opacities, inside looking out and outside looking in, functioning as a repository of the city's history. The ground and the fence, the most definitive aspects of the Gibbi, are never fixed. The ground is multiplying vertically to house a rapidly growing population, while the plots are shrinking to make way for the expansion of roadways. The Gibbi, however, is not a retreat from the world, but a site where we cultivate community. It is a stage for the reenchantment of everyday spaces and rituals in Addis Ababa. In Atlanta, a city settled as a terminus for federally funded railway lines, the construction of train and highway infrastructure has been used to violently displace or contain the movement of Black people. The diagonal line of the train tracks cutting across the city has transformed into the footprint of the highways that serve the same purpose, dividing the predominantly white and affluent North Atlanta from the predominantly Black and working class South Atlanta. In each one of these Black geographies, we have been examining the strengths and vulnerabilities of colonial cartography by thinking with the various ways in which Black people practice immeasurability in the face of and despite these algorithmic enclosures. These practices of dividing and ascribing value to land, what Bandar calls the racialized regime of ownership, rely on the presence or removal of Black life. By and large, in settler colonial states like the United States, land occupied by Black people is devalued. Then suddenly, driven by the magnetic force of whiteness, land starts to accrue value when the removal of Black people is detected. This cyclical process of devaluation and revaluation feeds the American regime of property. This is a map of the state of Georgia in 1861, measuring the percentage of enslaved Africans in each county, merging the measurement of land with the measurement of Black life, both rendered as property. This is why it's incredibly difficult to imagine a world after property, or to devise tactics that could potentially disentangle architecture from property, because this racialized value system is baked into the foundations of disciplines that investigate and intervene in the built environment today. So when Dr. Mabel Wilson and Sean Anderson invited us to be one of the participants for the exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, the participants, the curators, the institution itself, the Museum of Modern Art, knew that architecture could not survive a critical engagement with Black studies, because that would suggest a willingness to risk the core tenets of the discipline, namely form and permanence. We started our experiments by discarding the traditional understanding of architectural form as a totalizing container of meaning. Instead, we focused on the fact that we, Black people, have historically not been able to determine the form of the spaces we occupy, but we have been able to control what we do in those spaces through ephemeral events that either shift or completely reframe the meaning of everyday spaces. And this, of course, is a representational challenge because architectural representation has historically failed to attend to these temporal transformations. Conventional means of architectural representation either project or retroactively document how space is measured and partitioned, with minimal accounting of the ways in which the presence of living and breathing Black bodies shifts our understanding and experience of those partitions. Going further back in time, my first formal collaboration with Mpho Matsipa was a large tapestry for the traveling exhibition and series of workshops that she just presented under the framework of African Mobilities. And as I mentioned earlier, colonial cartography aims to contain the natives that are constantly on the move. While pre-colonial boundaries were not established to limit movement, but to intensify interactions between multiple tribes. Therefore, Black Counter Cartographies attend to the myriad ways in which these landscapes have been and continue to be indigenized. This is also the reason why most post-colonial cities, post-colonial cities, you will notice a shift in permanence between the European and indigenous section of the city. There were ordinances in place during the colonial era to make sure that the non-European section of the city was built with the most temporary and disposable materials, while the European section of the city is built with stone and concrete. So when Mpho invited us to participate in African Mobilities, we decided to produce a large tapestry, a timescape of the temporal materials used to build the marketplace over the past 80 years, thinking about the liminal space between codes and experiences. We collapsed Mercato into 126 scenes, learning from the notational systems developed by Charles Gaines for his Numbers and Trees series. So eucalyptus framing, corrugated metal, blue tarp, and loosely draped textiles as details of resistance against the tyranny of permanence imposed by the neocolonial development paradigm. In Atlanta, we focused on the racialization of everyday spaces, like chain restaurants, strip malls, and gas stations. And we wanted to examine how the mythical is embedded within the ordinary. In Atlanta, Waffle House is an extension of the nightclub. The strip club is a co-working space, and the highway is a dance floor. So we were interested in the spatial practices that introduce surreal conditions within these banal and repetitive spaces. We were also interested in the forest as a site of Black imagination, Paperboy weaving in and out of the woods or exiting back out into the gas station, oscillating between safety and danger, a theme that was revisited with the latest and final season's Safe House, or Young Thug dodging snakes in the woods, foreshadowing his current predicament. As an Ethiopian immigrant who moved to this country as a teenager, my transatlantic move from Addis Ababa to Marietta, Georgia, marked an embodied transition from a distant and relatively abstract understanding of my place in the world to a direct confrontation with the hierarchies that shape and maintain it. Therefore, my work is consistently attempting to understand what it might mean to reclaim Black internationalism in the 21st century, a multi-scalar Blackness from the bodily to the planetary. The non-dialectical thinker and philosopher Edward Glissant states that the Atlantic is a mausoleum. It forces us to find ourselves in relation with the other, refusing linear conceptions of time to think about the movement of Black people across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. This movement also marks the desire and the impossibility of the return. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the longest mountain range on the planet, also acts as a chasm, a marker of the unpayable debt and the ongoing extractive entanglements between Africa and the Americas, as a site of incalculable loss and the ghost note for the birth of racial capitalism. Our notational explorations of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge superimpose contemporary forms of surveillance and enclosure with complex cartographic practices. These are maps of the wind and ocean current patterns of the Atlantic, depicted by Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was nicknamed Pathfinder of the Seas. And they were produced for slave traders who were attempting to navigate the winds of the Atlantic. So again, measuring not only land, but also wind and ocean current patterns to facilitate racial slavery. Maury eventually resigned his commission as a US Navy commander and joined the Confederacy during the Civil War. Architecture concretizes existing regimes of power. Images like this, which is basically an etching by Peter Gordon, establishing the colony of Georgia in America, as an explicit depiction of this tendency. And his etching can be read as a foundational diagram for the spatial practices of settler colonialism. The dispossession of land from indigenous people was followed by the conversion of that land into measurable units of property. These questions of property and the ways in which we measure and share the planet were fundamental to our project Immeasurability. And we initiated our experiments and representation by thinking with indigenous cosmologies, both here and on the African continent, which for thousands of years have been predicated on the belief that land is sacred and communal. It cannot be measured, divided, and owned. So we constructed a narrative, a day in the life of a person in South Atlanta, moving between various nodes. And we conceptualized Black spatial practices between flow and form, like the slow material transformation from sand to glass. One of the materials found on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a magnetic black sand called magnetite. And this finding really focused our experiments, and we decided to use magnetite to model the Black quotidian spaces of Atlanta. We were working with glass artists at RISD, testing various combinations of black sand with accelerators, soda ash, cobalt, and glass powder. And we were attempting to reframe architecture as a form of sublime temporality, practices that transform spaces of subjugation into spaces of Black joy. And we worked iteratively through these image studies, experimenting with the overlaps between the woods of Atlanta and these ordinary spaces that appear as clearings within the forest. Again, thinking about the mythical and the ordinary. And our installation was made up of 2 discs, one horizontal and one vertical, both 6 feet in diameter. The horizontal disc is a dynamic model of everyday space in Atlanta, modeled as bricks. The magnetite sand shifts between the bricks, activated by a series of magnetic robots, moving on rails below the disc. And the vertical disc is a tapestry of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, considering historic and ongoing conditions of Afro-diasporic migration. This is a detail of the tapestry, demonstrating the slow process of, again, converting vectors into threads. And on the left, you can see a detail of the horizontal disc. And on the right, fragments of Atlanta. And we worked with musician Tafari Williams from Atlanta to compose a 24-minute soundscape, 1 minute for every hour of the day. And this followed a loose narrative that was established to lay out the bricks. The bottom shelf of the cone was used to house the speakers and the Raspberry Pi. And the top shelf was used to anchor the rails with the magnetic robots. The magnets shift back and forth on those rails, moving the sand across the circular disc. And there were two large collages on the walls framing the installation. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuel. Thank you, Mpho. And just for our audience, we will have time for you to ask questions. So there is a Q&A if you look at the bottom. So please leave your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them. But, you know, these were both fantastic presentations, and I will most certainly be rewatching. I think there was just so much richness, I think, in both of them. And I'm sure you have questions for each other, so I will definitely, you know, let you compose your thoughts. But maybe to get started, you know, I was thinking of Mpho, the way you talked about the waiting of time waiting. But also the way in which you are both thinking about that correlation of time and space and the way it is actually mobilized, right? Because we are talking about the cartographic and the spatial, but also an important dimension always of the spatial is the temporal. But I was also curious about time as containment and captivity, right? Because we always think about space in that way. But how have you both thought about the kind of question of time as containment, the sense of like never arriving to like the destination, whether it be modernity, whether it be to the category of the citizen or the human, or maybe even to life to some extent?
May I tack on time as containment or displacement? Kind of on the work you were doing with Mbembe's work on confinement and displacement. Yeah, I'd love to hear. That's a great question, Professor Wilson.
I mean, I think that you know, now that I'm thinking much more about the spatialization of time, my main focus has been on the Q as a spatialization of, you know, power, the distribution of power, which determines how people's times and bodies and energies can be deployed or not deployed in a given space and time. But increasingly for me, it's also raising questions around what other kinds of spatializations exist. And I think that the space of confinement and the way that that time is a disciplinary time is a lot easier in some ways to decipher. And I think that there are other ways that there's the kind of disciplinary time, but I think that there's also the ways in which time operates in deeply gendered ways that isn't always fully accounted for, which I find super interesting. And that gets spatialized in a number of other ways, even in the way that the city is organized. So I haven't thought deeply enough about it to give a meaningful response, but it occurs to me that there are so many other ways to think about the spatialization of panoptic time, but also the spatialization, which I think Emanuel's work does brilliantly, like the spatialization of a kind of promiscuous time in spaces like Atlanta. So I don't have an answer to the question, but I think it's something that I need to think about deeply. Yeah, because I mean, if for me, the most obvious example of time as a container is just the way that Africa is understood and represented, which Emanuel's work begins to explode, right? That like Africa is timeless, Africa is trapped in the distant past, Africa needs to catch up to what is imagined as, you know, a bright future, which is actually catastrophic and dystopian. So I think that there is a kind of conceptual and even like a material confinement in time in terms of like who gets to live where, under what conditions, and that is a form of containment, and also the amount of time and effort and labor and energy that's required to overcome this confinement is itself a form of containment. So a lot of your energy is actually spent not doing the thing you want to do, but overcoming the obstacle in order to arrive at a moment where you can actually do what you do. And I think that that's what the non-arrival is, right? That you're constantly kind of trying to get over. And that's a kind of theft of how you might choose to deploy your time if you were not operating within a panoptic frame. Emanuel?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I also think of it in reverse, because with a place like Ethiopia that has such a rich history, there's also a refusal to think of time beyond a certain moment of greatness. Like in the Ethiopian context, there's always a reference back to the 19th century, but almost a refusal to engage with anything that happened in the 20th century. So I feel like there's a certain documentation of that particular time of the Ethiopian Empire that doesn't account for the kind of decisions that were made to maintain sovereignty that eventually ended up compromising the stability of the zone, which is something that the place is still dealing with today. So I think sometimes a refusal to engage with the contemporary, or a refusal to engage with the messiness of our neocolonial entanglements, causes a certain myopic vision, which is referring back to images that are linked directly to very specific identities, which are also very exclusionary in the context of Ethiopia.
Yeah, no, thank you both for that. Yeah. I mean, oh, go ahead, Mpho.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you, Mabel. I mean, I think in relation to Vanessa's question around displacement, I think that's a very interesting way to maybe think about temporal imaginations in Ethiopia, Emanuel, that in some ways modernity, I mean, Addis is a thoroughly modern city. It's a new city, right? It's like, and that's an interesting way to think about modernity because of the place or non-place that settler colonialism played in it. So there is a kind of displacement of that narrative that creates other kinds of openings. So I think that this idea of time as promiscuous is also useful, that one could think about, colonial entanglements and entanglements with other temporalities. So is it productive to think about certain kinds of displacements as generative for other kinds of trajectories to be drawn out? It's a more complex thing, but I think that there's value in thinking about entanglement and displacement in relation to each other. Sorry, Mabel, to interrupt you, so I'm done.
Yeah, no, I was also just thinking, it's sort of been interested in the question of meter, meter both as a measurement of space, but meter is also a measurement of time. So there's something in that term that is a kind of correlation of value, that is both spatial and temporal, which is quite interesting, and to understand those things simultaneously, which is exactly, that sense of I read somewhere recently that in the Andes, so-called pre-Columbian, that term already is a kind of metric of, of civilization, that there was no difference between the past, the present, the future. They were simultaneous, actually. So the future was happening simultaneous with this moment, and as was the past, as opposed to the linearity, right, of Western time, which can produce the compartmentalization of materiologies. So, I think both in the ways in which you sort of talked about that question of the correlation of time space is fascinating. So, I mean, Vanessa, or you guys have questions to ask each other.
Sorry, I was just checking out our Q&A and we have a note of appreciation from Sophia Bandele, who notes that they're reading the book Chocolate Cities, the Black Map of American Life, which is their introduction to cartography. So they appreciate this forum as they grapple with this language. I have a question about, and I'm trying to pull together how this question might relate the two of your presentations. I'm not sure that it quite does it yet, but I'm really interested in the ways that you think the multiscalar, each of you, from the stratospheric Mpho, like the question of kind of what constitutes the stratosphere, another colonial construction, right? The stratosphere in relation to other zones of our atmospheric life, to the worlds in which we live, but also Emanuel too is thinking about multiscalar Blackness from the bodily to the planetary. I'm really interested in how you each think these kind of transscalar questions or multiscalar questions. And it coheres for me in this moment when Emanuel, in your presentation, you show an image of folks engaged in a certain kind of intimate relation while you're talking about confinement and displacement. And I'm curious about, for each of you, and Mpho, you were just talking about the kind of gendered coordinates of the spatialization of time. I'm wondering about scale and intimacies, scale and their relationship to our, kind of, I don't want to talk, private public is another kind of division that we're not interested in maintaining, but scale and its relationship to kind of intimate relation more broadly. The question is still emergent, but I'm curious about, this question of the stratosphere, who owns and governs the stratosphere that you asked, Mpho, has gotten me thinking about, how we understand the air that we breathe in the air and its relationship to other kind of zones of aerial presence. And then Emanuel's moment of thinking this multiscalar Blackness and that image. And I'm not sure where that image came from. I think it's one that you moved very quickly over. And I'd like to hear more about it and hear more about how you each want to move and work with the multiscalar. I myself write about sand in a very different way from the magnetite sand that you work with. Yet I'm still also working with black sand because I'm curious about its potential for helping us understand multiscalar approaches to history and to the politics of the body and our relations. So I want to hear more about how each of you are working those terms and frames.
I mean, I think that I proceeded from a kind of traditional geographic education of like scale hopping and how struggles happen at multi-scales to actually thinking about and thinking with Senzeni Makgasela's work, with this incredible work where she's basically sewing these blankets that are reproductions of extractive landscapes that are also worn, that are also speaking to embodied experiences. And so I think that there's something about the way in which the ecology, the stratosphere, the air, the rust, the ruin is breathed, lived, inhabited in very everyday ways. And the ways in which, the thing that fascinates me about her work is the way that she collapses them rather than sets them out as distinct and separate ways of reading. So the contour is also a shipelani, which could be a joyful skirt for dance, but is also a loss and a mourning. And it's and these kind of techniques of inversion and sewing and stitching and unraveling. So I'm interested in how one moment, or her discussion about dust produces an entire universe through which to read and understand the city, to think about extraction, to think about ecosystems, to think about gendered forms of labor, gendered forms of waiting, because that entire series is called Waiting for Gebani, which is a 6-year durational project. So I think very much with artists who are, I wouldn't say work in multiple scales, but who collapse it and who think about the way that it gets embodied, but also keep us aware of like the scale of the thing. And that's also my encounter with Lubumbashi, where so much of being in Lubumbashi has to do with the air that you breathe, but also like, yeah, it's about the air that you breathe. But the air that you breathe is rooted in like 200 years of colonial extraction. So I'm very curious about artists who can condense and collapse these things. So I think much more about intensity than I do about scale. Yeah, I think I'm thinking much more about intensities, and also like the sensorial as a way of registering things that are happening at different scales. So sound is also useful in that way.
Yeah, I think it's a tough question. I was actually hesitating to present some of the stuff on Black Sand, because I know, Vanessa, you've been thinking very deeply about Black Sand. We need to trade notes. But for me, you know, I think the multi-scalar actually came from the research we were doing into Atlanta. And at some point it became really frustrating to keep reading the same maps that represent the same inequities between North Atlanta, South Atlanta. And it was kind of a moment where I kind of had to zoom out. At least, you know, my practice is collaborative, but there are moments where our own subjective experiences begin to influence the work. And for me, it was zooming out and trying to think about a moment where my perception of myself shifted. And that moment was the moment where when I crossed the Atlantic and actually moved permanently to the United States. So the engagement with the city of Atlanta conceptually didn't work for me without engaging with the Atlantic. And also that engagement zoomed into the actual suburban homes that I grew up in, you know, like these incredibly generic suburban environments where African immigrants come together and cook up food that reminds them of home, knowing that they can never go back home. So I think those types of experiences began to influence the work a lot more. And that's what led to this oscillation back and forth between the bodily and the planetary. And I think recently we're doing some thinking around the compounds of Addis. And that was productive because, you know, it's one of those cities that you experience through a series of experiences in other people's compounds and in your own compound. But at some point, we started to understand the compound itself as a metaphor for the city, because the city very much operates as a compound. So this multi-scalar kind of subversive operation of thinking about the same idea has been really generative for us in both drawing and trying to produce images. Mpho, you're muted. Oh.
I've unmuted. I'm also curious about, like, when we think about scale, like the idea of intensity, but also, you know, there's also a kind of spiritual dimension to understanding space. And I don't know if it was you, Vanessa, or Emanuel, who talked about the way in which earth or soil or land is thought of in deeply spiritual ways. And that's something that I've been finding increasingly interesting. Like in Igbo culture, the earth is a deity called Allah, right? And one builds temples to it or shrines to it over a two-year period. So I wonder if scale is adequate, right? In terms of like the language of notation and how we account for space. If scale is an adequate metric, meter for how to think space. And there's something about looking at bodies, Black bodies, gendered bodies, queer bodies as measures in a way that can unravel an entire sort of like universe. And that's where McKittrick's work is so powerful, right? That like, if you think through what it actually means historically to be unmappable, to be unrepresentable, there's this whole other geography that traditional tools cannot account for. So what can we juxtapose scale with in order to resist invisibilization or compartmentalization, which is part of the logic of a kind of white cartography?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just to add to what Mpho just said, I know one of the artists you work with, Sami Baloji, does this really beautifully in his work as well, especially the images of those mining sites where the earth itself becomes our skin. And I think there's a particular way in which it implicates all of us. because we're using devices that basically produce those landscapes. And I think, yeah, there's an intimacy there as well when we engage with the images that he produces.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested maybe in that to maybe zoom in, and I think Emanuel, you were talking about the Gibi. Sorry, I'm going to mangle whatever that
Close
the
enough.
term is. But the way in which you said that its boundary is somewhat ambiguous, and also its function, right? The function in the sense that, let's say, you know, kind of modernism and program, that spaces have to be programmed specifically for use. But it sounds like it's not a type, it's just a term that could be used for many things, and it's bound. And I love the way you talked about it in relationship to the restless city, right? And so I was curious because, you know, the map and the line is always the delineation. It separates mine from yours. And so, you know, in what way could the question of boundary, or, you know, and maybe boundaries also wrapped up in the idea of being bounded and captive and contained. What happens, you know, kind of in these liminal spaces or even liminal temporalities, sort of the betweens of things in cities?
Yeah, that's like, that question is pretty much what we're trying to work through right now. And one thing I've been thinking about a lot is there's this linguistic strategy, Amharic linguistic strategy called Seven Nawark, which means wax and gold. And it's basically a linguistic strategy used by performers when they would go and perform to the emperors. So there would be a wax layer meaning, a very superficial meaning that everyone can pick up. And there's always some sort of deep political critique, which is the gold level meaning of the kind of performance or the poetry that they're delivering. And we've been thinking of that in relation to the Gibi, because the ways in which the wax and gold works is relies on how you enunciate specific words. So Gibi, when you say it loosely, like Gibi, it means come in, specifically to a female. Gabi, when you make it looser, it means income or the one that infiltrates. But Gibi means compound. So even in the word itself, it contains three different meanings that have three radically different political implications. And we're trying to figure out ways to—
It's the same spelling, but different enunciation, is that?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, but you would, because it's a phonetic alphabet, you can tighten and loosen it using the same spelling. So yeah, and I think the compounds, the Gibis, work in that way, primarily because land is owned by the state in Ethiopia. So you really don't have any control over the boundary. And it becomes this thickened negotiable space that requires you to engage with your neighbors or with someone who sets up shop outside of your Gibi, you know, and I think that's a really productive way to think about territory. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting because it's like, well, the territory requires two bodies, two people to negotiate, but also that the language requires embodiment, right? It requires a speech act in order for its meaning to be conveyed, as opposed to it just remaining abstract spelling and a very distinct definition, right? Exactly. So that's fascinating. Again, if you have questions for Mpho or Emanuel, please put them in the chat. I know there are questions out there.
I have a question for Mpho. Can you tell us a little bit more about Lubumbashi and how far along you are in that process?
I'm still in the ideation process. I mean, I plan to explore it in an open studio at Harvard in the spring. But I'm really thinking around I mean, the theme for 2022 was toxicity, and returning to Lubumbashi for the second time, I was really struck by the quality of the air and the dust, and the fact that there were so few trees. So this question of toxicity is not just an abstract term, it's something that is so bodily and everyday. And so I was trying to think about what is a creative response and how do I think through this question of infrastructure in relation to atmosphere, but also dereliction and decay. So how does one engage with the kind of afterlife of the Gashemin mine and its infrastructures and rewire them to produce something radically different? So it is about quiet acts within an environment that kind of denies or disavows life in many respects, but also being really struck by the fact that people live, right? So how does one engage meaningfully in that without actually contributing to this kind of wasteful, polluting production that some aspects of biennales and art production contribute to? So that's really where I am with it, and also developing a durational approach, right? So it's not about shipping work in and shipping work out. It's like engaging meaningfully with people who are already doing work in that environment and seeing whether the Mobilities model might add value. Emanuel, when I was listening to your talk, it was always like one of the things that we've discussed off and on over the last decade, and thank you for your very, very kind words at the beginning of your presentation. I've learned a lot from you too, and also about AAADS, and I wouldn't have been able to appreciate and read AAADS without having engaged with your work prior to that. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting, and maybe it seems banal, about the connections between colonial infrastructures in AAADS and in Atlanta was the fact that you were able to make this connection between these two sites that are often not thought of together, and the fact that you were able to think through the role of cartography in either stitching or separating different peoples. So I'm curious about this trajectory, and I'm also especially curious about your mapping of the Atlantic Rift. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ridge.
I'll say two things. Like recently, especially, doing this interview project, Where's Africa, has in a lot of ways helped me realize we need to reclaim a certain form of Black internationalism, mid-20th century Black internationalism, where there's an incredible porosity of ideas between the continent and the diaspora. And intuitively, I was resisting the connection between AAADS and Atlanta because, of course, I, for a while, saw myself as someone who is from AAADS, but happened to live in Atlanta. But at this point in my life, I've lived the majority of my life in the United States. So that claim is no longer relevant. And I found it much more productive to try to find connections between these places that are seemingly radically different from each other. And that's been informing the work differently because an engagement with Atlanta allows me to read AAADS differently, but also an engagement with AAADS allows me to read Atlanta differently. And sometimes it's really about the echoes of these colonial interventions, but also the forms of resistance that materialize differently in the two sites. I think, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I think also, being explicit about urban landscapes and landscapes in the United States as settler colonial landscapes that use colonial mechanisms in order to delineate forms of life, or distinctions between the human and the non-human, is a productive way for understanding it. And what I was thinking also was about your method is it's a very sort of it does a really good work of synthesizing these technologies and these mechanisms for organizing and resisting forms of closure, whether it's temporal closure or spatial closure, and also points to strategies for how one can imagine more porosity, more ambiguity, more performativity, negotiation between and among spaces. And thinking through that might open up different modes of practice and different ways of imagining space in the United States, because I think that there's a tendency also to have an area studies model, that there's some things that are so distinctly, discretely African and have no relevance for any other geography. But when one thinks about the kind of clarity that certain kinds of formations have in different African contexts, it can really sort of magnify conditions that have been kind of like tampered down or buried under euphemism in places elsewhere. So I think it's a really productive way to think relationally, which is maybe another way to think through this question of scale. Vanessa.
Yeah, but also just the kind of the crisis of imagination in the West, you know, and how a re-engagement with, you know, Nyerere's Ujamaa, for example, gives us resources to reimagine cities, even here in the United States, or re-engagement with Nkrumah and how a certain idea of a Pan-African aesthetic practice could actually shape the ways in which we reimagine representation within the fields of architecture and urbanism. So I think some of it is also understanding that maybe the Western archive has been exhausted and we need other resources. And sometimes those resources require us to travel across time and across space, but they begin to provide alternative futures. And I think most of those futures produce images and spaces that are even temporarily, at least, liberating, you know, at least, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was thinking about that, and, you know, certainly in the work on toxicity that Vanessa works on, I think is important, because Mpho, you were citing Toni Morrison about, you know, the impoverishment of the future, but I almost feel like under the West, the future is impossible because of the toxicity of extraction. Makes the future, it's literally making a future impossible for the species, right? So it's the future is never there. It's just what's accessible now, and the now is merely a fiction of wealth, like that is not even real to some extent. And so, you know, that question of another kind of imagination, I think, is absolutely important, because I don't think that futurity it's not going to get us anywhere, literally.
I just want to acknowledge we have another question in the Q&A from Maya Butler, who says, I don't know, Maya, if you'd like to pose your question live, or I'm happy to read it. I'm not sure how that works.
I think you have to read it.
I have to read it? Okay.
Yeah.
Butler says, thank you all so much, speakers and organizers. I am very appreciative as a literary geographer that Mpho opened with Toni Morrison. I'm thinking in my own work about literary representations of the enduring utility of practices of mahonnage as a Black spatial practice. The phrase out of time that Mpho used, I'm now interested in thinking more about this alongside of the sort of out of spaceness of mahonnage. I'm not sure that I have a specific question because I'm still buzzing with this new possibility, but do you all have any more thoughts about this out of spaceness and mahonnage?
So I'm also thinking through this question, and I was struck by something that Emanuel said, and something that I've been thinking about a lot too, which is around this fixation with calculability and permanence, which is a kind of hallmark of Western modernity, and how things that are ephemeral are not valued. And so there's something about this relationship between space as something that is not fixed and permanent, but that is maybe repeated, or that is fugitive in its nature, could be useful to think through. So I think that the category of or the concept of marronage is interesting in that sense, because it helps one to conceptualize both this. It's another way of conceptualizing the spatialization of time, right? That it's a fugitive space that is not necessarily permanent, but that does very important work for a group of people at a particular space and time, and allows you to negotiate one space in order to leap into another. So it's a different kind of way of moving through space. So it's not just about space as container, but space as I don't know, space is something else.
Yeah, I love that answer, because I feel like basically movement is the best way to resist measurement. And I think cartographic practices want to freeze the world. You know, they want to freeze both human and more than human beings. And I think
cartographic practices?
I would say Western colonial cartographic practices.
I think your maps were pretty, that map that you showed of all of the wind and yeah.
It's exactly Matthew Fontaine Maury. He's just trying to freeze these moments, you know, to be able to kind of measure them so they can navigate the Atlantic. And I think to me, at least fugitivity, at least for kind of the visual practices and for kind of design and architecture, becomes a representational challenge that is kind of existential, I would say, you know, because architecture also is very much implicated in this obsession with form and permanence. And I think that the types of resistance that we are thinking about and working through actually resist the freezing, primarily because the ways in which we've been measured devalues our lives and our environments.
But I wonder, can we think of Black internationalism that's not premised on bodily mobility? I mean, one of the things that I'm really concerned with are the ways that mass immobilities are truly the kind of lived experience of many Black people around the world, right? The immobility of, I mean, I too had a time lived in Atlanta. I was a public school teacher there, and my students who came through my classrooms are all still in the exact same neighborhood we were in 2002, right? 20 years, most of whom have not left in any way, shape, or form. And I work in Martinique, which is all about Fanon, Glesson, Césaire, right? A Black international vision where the majority of the people with whom I work have never left the island, right? There's a kind of fascination with a kind of cosmopolitan mobility that I want to de-link from bodily mobility in some ways and think of Black internationalism that, yes, of course, is about the circulation of our political and intellectual life and solidarities, but also in an era of the kind of carbon footprint that we occupy, right, is also a kind of ethical question about mobility and its relationship to the kinds of political worlds that we seek to build. I'm curious about those kinds of questions as you both think mobilities, solidarities, internationalisms. And yes, the cartographic freezing is the, you know, as you say, movement is the best resistance to measurement. Is that kind of how you framed it a moment ago? But what of the unmovable or the unmoving, or the moving only within a radius of 50 meters? Or I'm curious about those forms of life and community as we might think them.
I mean, I think that digital space is a really interesting way to think through those questions around like cultural, aesthetic mobility and exchange, and how ideas circulate. but it also, I mean, and that's something that I was very mindful of in my curatorial strategy. So there was a podcast, which is about orality and people being able to access things without needing to be in a library or having anything more than a bit of data, but also breaking it up into like really small increments. So there was like a 1-minute podcast or like a snippet that can travel through WhatsApp. So basically riding on existing infrastructures, but using them against their grain in order to forge these kind of very ephemeral connections that then find another place to return. So there was no guarantee that I was ever going to see Emanuel Admassu again, and here we are. And many, many other people. So I think that there's something interesting about the ways in which the digital sphere, with all of its problems, and in all the ways that it's compromised, did enable a form of connectivity, communication, and networking that was not that easy to do before. And I think that this moment of kind of communicative crisis is an interesting one, where people are trying to rethink how do we stay in touch? Do we want to stay in touch? So I think that for me, as somebody who had very limited resources, but wanted to be in conversation with a wide range of people across a distributed geography, this technology was absolutely key, because it's, you know, like, it doesn't cost much. And it allows me to kind of work around, through, against, beyond kind of ossified institutional academic structures. So that's kind of how I think through this question of mobility, circulation, but also restitution, right? So some people have the privilege of mobility and others don't. And so how does one address that in one's practice, rather than reinscribing those cartographies?
Yeah.
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 I think all of these, all of these categories can be worked either way. Immobility can be containment. Immobility can be refuge. It can be, and I think it's a question of how it's literally mobilized by agents. That is important. We are at 6:02. So Emanuel, you will have the last word. And I know there's some questions in the chat. So thanks to folks who left those.
It's definitely not a last word kind of statement, but I'll say this beautiful question about immobility made me think about your earlier question as well, Vanessa, about the image I showed, which is an image from Mati Diop's film Atlantics, which is an incredibly powerful image of immobility as well, because instead of the movie focusing on the young men who were leaving the coast, the coast of Senegal and migrating to Europe, the film focused on the young women who stayed behind. And I think that is fundamentally the type of work that we have to do, because even the engagement with the marketplaces was an attempt to think about this rural to urban migration as an alternative to the transatlantic or transnational migration, which presents a lot more risks for folks in Ethiopia. So that, yeah, I think that's something that we have to find a way to think about.
Fantastic. This has really been an extraordinary conversation. It could clearly go on and on. There were some really amazing questions and comments emerging in the Q&A, but Vanessa and I really do want to thank you, Mpho, and Emanuel, for your brilliant thoughts on time space beyond the conventional cartographic into sort of counter cartographic imaginaries that are both political, social, spiritual. And I do want to give, as always, a special thanks to our dedicated colleague, Sharon Harris, who makes this webinar and so much else happen at AAAADS and IRAAS, Sean Mendoza, and our IRAAS assistants, Olivia Pearson, and also James Jennings, who's been really on the chat with some amazing additions. And they were essential to shaping tonight's events. This is our last event this semester. The Black Counter Cartographic series continues next semester with 3 more amazing dialogues. So please check our website for this and other events. You can find that at afamstudies.columbia.edu. And I do want to thank our audience for joining us today, for your insightful questions in this third dialogue of Black Counter Cartographies. So everyone, please take care and be well. Bye all. Thank you.